This video is a special Patreon request by Snooze. Thank you so much for supporting me. In the early 1980s, everything was all about outer space thanks to a little movie called Star Wars. The arcade games of this era had utilized the outer space theme as well, including titles such as Asteroids, Defender, and Space Invaders. It wasn't until 1981 when a revolutionary color vector game with a unique spinner knob was unleashed onto the public. The name of the game was Tempest. It featured bright, colorful visuals and fast, frenetic gameplay. What was the original game supposed to be? What does Tempest have to do with a certain feminine hygiene product? Let's find out as we spin our way into the history of Tempest. The year is 1981, and Atari designer Dave Toyer is designing his next arcade game. Mr. Toyer was no stranger to designing arcade games, especially ones that were bona fide hits. His first game was a 1979 four-player soccer game for Atari. He followed that one up with a smash hit Missile Command. Mr. Toyer had been a fan of Space Invaders, and even had the unit installed in Atari Labs to play on his break. He decided to make a first-person perspective reimagining of Space Invaders. The initial prototype was black and white vectors before moving on to the color version. He managed to get a playable game with a very convincing 3D effect. Rows upon rows of angry aliens were coming towards you, but there was a problem. The game just wasn't any fun. Because the game was in 3D, it made it hard to determine where the aliens were at and at what height to shoot them. He decided to go back to the drawing board to rethink his concept. He had recalled this strange recurring dream where monsters were crawling out of the ground from a deep, dark pit. He decided to take this vague concept and with the help of Atari's color 3D vector graphics, decided to turn this into what we know as Tempest. He set about designing all of the graphics for the game in a very old school way by taping sheets of graph paper together. The reason it was done this way was because there were no graphic tools available. During development, the game was initially known as Aliens. This was changed later to Vortex. Everybody on the development team liked this name, but noticed some players were laughing and claiming it sounded too much like Tampax. A vote was taken and Tempest was decided upon. Something else that was changed from the prototype were the controls. Long before a certain 5-time WCW champion was doing the spinneroonie, we were spinning to our heart's content thanks to the fabulous controls on this game. The spinner offered precision movements and just the right amount of resistance for the game. Tempest was released in 1981 by Atari. The object of the game is to survive for as long as possible while racking up as many points as possible. At the end of the playfield, enemies appear and slowly move towards your ship. You have to shoot all the enemies while avoiding their fire, all the while utilizing the wonderful spinner control. When all of the enemies are destroyed, you are warped to the next level. Thanks to the state-of-the-art color vector graphics, the transition between levels are nice and smooth. After a few levels, you have to either shoot or avoid the spikes when warping between levels. You do lose a life when coming into contact with an enemy or the spikes, so be careful. Depending on the dip switch settings, you can earn extra lives. You may hold up to 6 ships at once. One handy dandy feature is the Super Zapper button, which will clear all the enemies once per level. You can use it a second time, but the effects will be muted. The Super Zapper will recharge at the start of each level. There are 16 different playfields, and once these are completed, the game repeats, only this time the colors of the playfield are different and the difficulty is higher. As I mentioned, this was the first game to use Atari's color quadra-scan vector display technology. The game utilized something called a skill step feature, which allowed advanced players to skip ahead to the harder, more challenging levels. There was a bug in early revisions of the game where the player could earn up to 40 credits. This was created inadvertently by Mr. Toyer when he was correcting an offset graphic on the title screen. The arcade cabinets shipped in a few different flavors. The most widely seen was the full-size cabinet, which featured gorgeous side art. When viewing from the side, it looked like a right triangle sitting on top of a rectangle. There was also a cocktail style which allowed two players to play at opposite ends of the game. The screen would automatically flip for each person. The game was a huge success for Atari, selling over 30,000 cabinets. Players gravitated towards the high-tech vector display and loved the perfectly balanced gameplay. With a game this large and in charge, the conversions were flowing like wine. Let's take a look at the unreleased Atari 2600 version. Upon first glance, it looks like somebody ate a whole bunch of vectors and threw them up all over my screen. Now, of course, there was no way they were going to replicate the state-of-the-art vector graphics on the primitive Atari 2600, but this is just bad. There is also a ton of flicker going on as well, and I started to pray for a seizure so I could stop playing the darn thing. The game was supposed to release in 1984, but was scrapped 3/4 of the way through development. Perhaps this was a good thing. Another unreleased version was on the Atari 5200. This was thought to be the holy grail when it came to collecting on the Atari 5200. Now, even though the game never came out, a box copy could be seen in the 1984 Cloak and Dagger movie. A 50% complete prototype was finally unearthed back in 1998. This looked really good, with the vectors being translated almost flawlessly. One thing that was not included in the prototype was collision detection. However, the original programmer decided to go back and finish the game. This is one of the best home conversions of Tempest, from the graphics, to the sounds, to the playability. The game was released in full cartridge format and is available for purchase on AtariAge.com. The Spectrum version is up next, and even though it's in black and white, this is an excellent conversion. The Specky does a really good job with the vector graphics, and the animation not only is fast, but smooth. They even included the transitions between levels, which is an added bonus. The gameplay is nice and tight and feels like you're playing the arcade game. The sound effects could be better, but the core gameplay is there, and that's all that counts. The Amstrad version looks to be a port of the Spectrum, only with nice, vibrant colors. The graphics and animation are just a tad bit smoother in this version as well. We also have really good sound effects this time around. The playability is on par with the Spectrum, so it feels really nice. The game is very impressive considering it's running on an 8-bit machine. There was even a version of Tempest for the BBC Micro, but out of all the 8-bit ports, this one is the weakest. Don't get me wrong, the graphics resemble the arcade game with nice vibrant colors, but the speed of the gameplay is just a bit too slow. The sound effects, while reasonable for about 20 seconds, will soon wear out their welcome, so you might want to keep a finger on the volume button just in case. The gameplay is only average at best, with everything feeling just a little bit too stiff.
That's what she said!
The Atari ST port looks good when compared to the arcade game. The animation is fairly smooth and the speed is close to the arcade original. The downside when talking about the graphics is the inclusion of the giant scoreboard on the right side of the screen, which hinders the playfield. The sound effects and music could be better, as they tend to grate on your nerves after a while. All of the levels from the arcade game are included. The original Tempest was included as part of Midway Arcade's Greatest Hits, the Atari Collection. It was released on various consoles such as the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and the Super Nintendo version, which is what I'm showing here. The graphics, while a bit on the blocky side, feature nice, vibrant colors. The animation is nice and smooth along with the gameplay. The sound effects and music are straight out of the arcade game. Overall, it's a pretty good conversion. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn versions are almost identical to the arcade game. In 1994, released for the Jaguar console was Tempest 2000. This was developed by local living llama lover himself, Jeff Minter, for his LlamaSoft company. This is highly regarded as one of the best Jaguar games ever to be released, selling over 30,000 copies for the system. Mr. Minter must have been smoking some crazy drugs during development because this is one trippy game. The graphics make excellent use of psychedelic colors and awesome special effects. The music blends in perfectly with the graphics, making it one of the best versions of Tempest on the market. New to this game is the power-up system, which enhances your ship's firepower and makes the enemies easier to kill. There are a few other modes of play included, as well as a recreation of the original arcade game. Mr. Minter had programmed in controls for a spinner dial, even though the Jaguar did not have such a controller. Unfortunately, Atari never did release such an add-on. The game was so successful that versions were also released for MS-DOS, PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn. In 1996, Tempest X3 was released for the original PlayStation. Not only were the graphics updated, but apparently Mr. Minter's drugs were also updated as well, because this is psychedelic cranked up to 11. All jokes aside, the graphics are fantastic and are a visual treat for any fan of Tempest. The core gameplay remains the same and feels true to the arcade original. There are just enough changes in the gameplay so it seems fresh, but it still feels like the original arcade game. Check it out if you're a fan. Probably the greatest Tempest game you've never played is Tempest 3000, which was released exclusively for play with the Nuon technology. For those of you who don't know, this technology was added to special DVD players which allowed certain 3D video games to be played along with enhanced DVD tools. This was also written by Jeff Minter and is based off of Tempest 2000, although it does feature a few gameplay enhancements. To my knowledge, there is no emulator to play this game, so you have to find a real DVD player with this technology to experience this game. In 2014, TXK was released by LlamaSoft on the PlayStation Vita. The game is a tube shooter and is based on Tempest with greatly expanded gameplay including power-ups. The same psychedelic graphics and sounds are on display and it looks great. The game was supposed to release on PC, PS4, and the Android platforms, but Atari made legal threats against the company, saying it was too similar to Tempest 2000. Jeff Minter came forth and broke the news that Atari had issued a cease and desist order on the release of any new versions. Despite all the legal troubles with Atari, Jeff Minter worked with the company and released Tempest 4000 in 2018. If you have ever wanted to drop acid and get your game on, this is the game for you. The graphics have been updated in all their psychedelic glory with resolutions up to 4K. The soundtrack has been influenced by 1990s techno music and it sounds really good. The same fantastic gameplay found in previous versions of Tempest makes its return, and it feels just like the classic arcade game. The game is available on Steam, PS4, and Xbox One. Before we end this video, let's go back to 1982 and take a look at Tempest Tubes. This was a brute force hack on the original arcade board by arcade owner Duncan Brown. He had mastered the original game of Tempest and wanted to create more levels that were also more challenging. For years, this circulated among arcade owners without Mr. Duncan's name attached to it. In 1998, Hasbro identified and tracked down Mr. Brown and asked him if they could include his version on their compilation Atari Arcade Hits Volume 1. Mr. Brown accepted and was paid $1,000 for his work. It's a neat little curiosity, so if you're a fan of Tempest, be sure and check it out. And that wraps up the history of Tempest. The game has endured numerous sequels and remakes over the last 39 years, proving how innovative both the graphics and the gameplay were. This is another game that works pretty good under emulation, but the absolute best way to play this is with the spinner knob. If you've never tried Tempest before and are a fan of shoot-'em-ups, you owe it to yourself to try out one of the various versions. You'll be glad you did. If you like my videos and want to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my content. It's the only way my channel can grow. Thanks for watching.